On the whole, the village of St. Anselm considered itself very lucky in its summers. They were not, to be sure, the blazing affairs described in foreign novels, where peasants flung themselves into fountains and olives ripened on trees, but they were, in their modest English way, respectable summers. Lawns that browned only slightly round the edges, roses that did their duty in June, and a sun that shone often enough to justify the purchase of deck chairs. On a certain Saturday afternoon in late July, the sun was doing rather more than its duty. It shone full upon the lawns of Old Hall, upon the white linen-covered tables under the yew hedge, upon the good ladies of the St. Anselm Women's Guild, and upon the rows of homemade jams arranged like stained-glass windows by the vicar's wife. It even shone, though less kindly, upon the slightly cracked stucco of Old Hall itself, reminding those inclined to notice such things that time touches houses as well as people. The occasion was the annual summer fete in aid of the church roof fund. The roof, as Canon Pembroke had explained in several sermons, was in a deplorable condition and quite unfit to withstand another winter. The congregation, surveying it from below, could see no particular cause for alarm, but they agreed that roofs, like clergymen, must be taken on trust. Old Hall belonged to Sir Geoffrey Lanyon, whose family had once owned half the county and behaved accordingly. Sir Geoffrey himself possessed the slightly baffled air of a man who no longer understood quite where his money had gone, or why the servants had disappeared in such numbers. He had a long melancholy face, a fondness for poor, and a conscientious wife who arranged charity festivals on his behalf. Lady Lanyon, in a hat that looked faintly ecclesiastical, moved from group to group, making sure that the raffle tickets were properly sold, that no child had 2 goes on the coconut sheet without paying, and that Mrs. Viney's sponge cake, which had already taken 3 prizes in 3 separate years, was adequately admired. Under a striped awning near the house, Miss Jane Marple of Seacole, Mary Mead sat with a cup of tea and the mild air of one who has retired from active participation but remains interested in the frailties of others. She had come to St. Anselm for a fortnight, at the urgent invitation of her nephew Raymond and his wife Joan, who had taken a cottage on the hill beyond the village. Miss Marple had protested that one village was much like another, and that she knew her own wees too well to leave them to their devices, but she had come all the same, and was now fighting St. Anselm a most virgastero. Beside her, Joan West, née Marple, lounged with the enviable irresponsibility of those who are not expected to produce cakes or knit for bazaars. "I do like watching people when they think they are only as being sociable," she remarked, following Miss Marple's gaze. "It's practically immoral, the amount one can see." "My dear," said Mr. Marple mildly, "people show themselves most clearly when they believe they are not observed. The only question is whether one pays attention. Most people do not." Her blue eyes, faded yet shrewd, travelled slowly over the crowd. There was Canon Pembroke talking earnestly to Sir Geoffrey and making little vigorous gestures with his right hand, as though he were still in the pulpit. There was Mrs. Vinny, stout and triumphant behind her cakes, artfully concealing from Mrs. Tallis the knowledge that the sponge owed part of its volume to a small quantity of custard powder. There were the Baxters, Major Baxter with his military moustache and his wife with an anxious air that suggested a chronic fear of social mistakes. Near the croquet lawn, a small knot of younger people lounged as youth lounges nowadays, untidily, with a faint suggestion of defiance. Raymond West, Miss Marple's nephew, was among them, laughing with an intensity that suggested he was determined to find everything more amusing than it was. Beside him was a dark, handsome young woman in a green frock, whom Miss Marple had already catalogued as artistic, unreliable, and badly brought up. "That's Eleanor Blake," Joan supplied, following the direction of her aunt's glance with the ease of long practice. "She does something with book jackets. The tall man is Dr. Hugh Latimer, a local demigod, and the other one is Peter Fielding, the solicitor's son. Oh, and the thin, pale girl is Agnes Hall. She's Lady Lanyon's paid companion. Looks about 17 and terrified of everything. Pretty old girl to his herding." In a washed-out way, Miss Marple observed, "The kind that gets imposed upon. It's a dangerous thing to be afraid, especially when one is young." "Agnes," Joan laughed. "She's hardly dangerous, Aunt Jane." Miss Marple's needles, for she was knitting something unidentifiable in pale blue wool, clicked gently. "I did not say she was dangerous, my dear. I said it is dangerous to be afraid. It makes one do foolish things, or sometimes very brave ones. It is so seldom easy to tell the difference at the time." From the bandstand, a somewhat wavering rendition of Rule Britannia began. Children squealed near the hoopla. A dog barked frantically at a Valen, and over everything hung the faint, comforting smell of slightly overdone scones. It was at that precise and very English moment that the peace of the afternoon fractured. The actual sound was not very dramatic. Not a scream, nor a crash, nor an explosion. Nothing that would have satisfied the requirements of fiction. It was nearer to a cry choked off and a softer, heavy thud, as though something or someone had slipped and fallen on well-kept turf. It came from the direction of the shrubbery beyond the croquet lawn, where a narrow path led down towards the ornamental pond. Joan started and half rose. Miss Marple's needles paused in mid-air. Around them, conversation faltered. People turned in that curious simultaneous way of groups sensing that something unanticipated has occurred. "Someone's fallen," Raymond said, already moving. "Probably one of the children. Come on, Peter." Dr. Latimer was quicker. He broke into a run, dark head bent, shoulders thrust forward. A moment later Major Baxter followed, swearing under his breath. Lady Lanyon, who had been in the middle of telling Mrs. Tallis about a particularly obstinate plumber, stopped with her mouth open. What was that?" she stammered. Canon Pembroke, whose experience of parish life was wide, said gravely, "We shall know in a moment, Lady Lanyon. If it is one of the children, we must keep the others back." Miss Marple rose, surprisingly light for her age, and set down her knitting. "You stay here, Aunt Jane," Joan urged. "It might be nothing." "It is very seldom nothing, my dear, when people sound like that," Miss Marple replied. "And foolish though I may be, I am still less foolish than some." By the time they reached the edge of the shrubbery, a small crowd had formed, held at bay by Major Baxter's outstretched arms. "Keep back, please. Give the doctor room. No use, all of you tramping about." Through a gap in the ring of people, Miss Marple could just see the bright shimmer of the pond and, on the grass by its edge, a dark shape that did not look in any way like a child. Dr. Latimer was kneeling beside it. His head was bent, his hands moving quickly and efficiently. Then they stopped. There was a brief, almost imperceptible pause. When he looked up, his face had altered. "I'm afraid," he said, and in that neatly graded social voice of his there was something flat and final. "We shall have to send for the police. Sir Geoffrey, perhaps you would telephone Miss Blake." His eyes flicked briefly to Eleanor. "I think this is your employer." Look, the dark shape on the grass was no longer anonymous. It was a man in a light summer suit, where one arm flung out, the other crooked beneath him, as though he had been surprised, very much surprised, and had had no time to adjust to it. His head was twisted at an odd angle, and his open eyes stared up at the blazing indifference. It was Mr. Charles Denham, the guest of honour at the fete, the London publisher who had taken the small house by the mill only a fortnight before. He was, as a Dr. Latimer had so economically put it, quite so certainly dead. And in the midst of the shocked murmur, as questions and exclamations rose and fell, Miss Marple looked not at the dead man, but at the living faces around her. The frightened, the curious, the calculating. That, she said very softly, more to herself than to anyone else, is most interesting. For a moment there was the peculiar stillness that comes when people are not yet certain whether what they are witnessing is accident, illness, or something darker. Then Mrs. Bantry let out a strangled exclamation and clutched at Miss Marple's arm. "Vivian! Oh, good heavens, Vivian!" "Best keep people back there, Doctor," Haydock said curtly, his fingers already at the dead woman's wrist, his eyes flicking with professional briskness to her pupils, her mouth, her throat. After only a moment he gave the slightest shake of his head. "Nothing to be done. She's gone." The phrase, simple and spare, seemed to loosen tongues. A ripple went through the crowd, voices rising like agitated starlings. "Heart, I should think," announced Mrs. Price Ridley in a carrying whisper. "Oh, all that strain running the trust, and that dreadful boy of hers, bound to give out." "Heat stroke," encountered Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, adjusting his spectacles as though the world had gone slightly out of focus. These days, people underestimate the sun, particularly at her age. Miss Marple said nothing. She was watching Eleanor Morrison, who stood quite still near the rose arch, her gloved hands pressed together, so tightly that the knuckles showed white through the kid leather. Her eyes were fixed not on the body, but on the scattered crumbs at Vivian's side. "It would be as well," Miss Marple observed in her mild voice, "if no one touched anything." I think you know the doing is that we must send for Colonel Melchett. Dr. Caredoc looked up sharply. His nostrils, too accustomed to the scent of disinfectant and ether, had not missed the faint trace of bitter almond that lingered on the warm air. I believe you're quite right, Miss Marple. Colonel Melchett, Chief Constable of the county, arrived with commendable speed, accompanied by Inspector Slack, whose heavy tread and suspicious brow were by now well known to the inhabitants of St. Mary Mead. At none of this time, the spectacle of half the village pressed decorously about the rose garden, while trying not to appear to stare would have been amusing. Now the undercurrent of excitement was tinged with fear. "Unexpected death at a public gathering," Melchett muttered, surveying the scene. "Damn awkward. Slack, get everyone back. Names, statements. No one leaves the grounds without our say-so." "Is that really necessary, Colonel?" protested Mrs. Price Ridley. "After all, poor Mrs. Claremont." "Precisely, madam," Melchett cut in. "Poor Mrs. Claremont. Until we know how she died, we proceed as though a crime may have been committed." The word crime hung in the air like the tolling of a bell. Slack, eager to exert authority, began shepherding people away with broad, impatient gestures. "You'll all have your turn. Don't you worry. Names to dresses. Just you stay put by the tea tent. You too, Fletcher. No wandering off." Tommy, pale and wide-eyed, allowed himself to be led away by his mother, casting a final, fascinated glance over his shoulder. At Melchett's request, "Doctor, Haydock gave a brief, guarded account. "Death not due to any obvious natural cause," he concluded. "The lips are, and there is a particular odour. I should prefer to reserve judgment until after a post-mortem, but I must say, Colonel, I don't like it." "Nor do I," Melchett said grimly. "That cake, where did it come from?" It was a small, dainty object, and its twin still resting on a gilt-edged plate a short distance away, where it must have fallen from Vivian's hand when she collapsed. Miss Marple's eyes rested on it thoughtfully, recalling the bustling scene by the refreshment table earlier. Plates and trays passing from hand to hand, helpful ladies, rearranging, tidying, offering. "The petit four were on the central tray," volunteered Mrs. Bantry, who had followed them back, her natural curiosity overcoming her sense of decorum. "Vivian took one just before going to see the roses. I saw her. She said she needed something sweet after all that talk of deficits." "Deficits?" Melchett's ears pricked. "The Claremont Trust, Colonel," Miss Marple said gently. "There has been some discussion in the village. One hears things, you know. Investments, economies. I dare say money is at the back of it, as it so often is." Melchett grunted. "We shall look into her affairs. Meanwhile, where's the companion? Miss Morrison isn't it? So he did it." Elena stepped forward at once, as though she had been expecting the summons. Her dark eyes were overbright, but her voice was steady. "I'm here, Colonel. Anything I can do to help, of course." Miss Marple watched the girl closely. The nervous trembling of earlier was gone. In its place was a sort of composed determination, like someone who has rehearsed for a moment and is now playing her part. "In due course, Miss Morrison," Melchett replied. "First I must ask, did Mrs. Claremont have any known enemies, anyone who might wish her harm?" The question, asked bluntly in official tones, might have been expected to produce indignant denial. Instead, there was a curious little silence, broken only by the faint distant sound of the brass band faltering to an uncertain halt. Then, from the cluster of onlookers, David Claremont laughed, a short, harsh sound that made several people start. "Enemies, he said. "My dear Colonel, I should think you'll need a notebook to list them all." Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap. Human nature, she reflected, was very much the same everywhere, in London clubs, in village fêtes, and in the shadow of rose gardens. When a woman like Vivian Claremont died suddenly, the trouble was seldom in finding a motive. It was in choosing, among many, the one that mattered. The village, being what villages are, had reached 3 different and entirely contradictory conclusions about the crime by the following morning. At the butcher's, it was firmly agreed that David Claremont had finally stabbed. Well, outside the post office, opinion favoured a mysterious foreigner said to have been seen loitering near the bus stop, though no one could quite agree on his appearance. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley announced with conviction that these companions were never what they seemed, and that poor Mrs. Claremont had been far too trusting. Miss Marple, however, neither speculated nor pronounced. She sat by the window of her neat cottage in the High Street, her knitting in her lap and a small notebook on the table beside her. A careful observer might have seen that the notebook contained no dramatic revelations, merely names, times, and small, seemingly inconsequential remarks overheard during yesterday's turmoil. She had jotted down, for instance, that Elena had been seen behind the rose trellis, writing a hurried note, that Vivian had insisted on personally selecting her cakes from the central platter, that 3 Petit Fours had contained cyanide, yet only one had found its way to the intended victim, and that young Tommy Fletcher, inquisitive to a fault, had been darting in and out of the refreshment tent all afternoon. The front gate clicked. Bantry swept in without waiting to be invited, as was her custom in times of crisis. "My dear Jane, have you heard? They've taken that poor girl, Elena, into custody. Slack is convinced she's a scheming adventuress who wormed her way into the household." Miss Marple's needles resumed their measured clicking. "Indeed, that is interesting. You don't think she did it, then?" Mrs. Bantry demanded eagerly, seating herself where the morning sun fell pleasantly across the carpet. "Of course she might have. These quiet ones so often do. But there's something rather desperate about her, I always thought. Not cold-blooded. Desperation can be quite as dangerous as cold calculation," Miss Marple murmured, "though it rarely arranges itself so tidily for the police." Mrs. Bantry brightened. "Then you agree the case is too tidy?" "I should not like to say," Miss Marple replied mildly, "but when 3 cakes are poisoned and only one is eaten by the intended victim, I cannot help wondering about the other 2. People do seldom behave exactly as they are meant to." That afternoon brought a call from Dr. Haydock, who arrived under the pretext of checking Miss Marple's blood pressure. Having duly pronounced her sounder than most women 20 years younger, he lowered his voice. "Slack is determined to make a clean sweep. He's discovered that Miss Morrison drew a considerable sum from her bank 2 weeks ago, and has made inquiries about passages to the continent. Running away from something, Miss Marple uttered softly. "Or toward it?" Haydock chuckled. "Trust you to put it that way. There's more. Melchett's obtained the draft of that codicil. Vivian was cutting out David almost entirely, leaving the bulk of her fortune to a charitable trust, with Elena as secretary and administrator." But Miss Marple did not exclaim, though the information was significant. "So now she has both strong motive and opportunity," she said. "How very convenient for whoever actually wished Mrs. Claremont dead." Dr. Haydock frowned. "You really think she may be innocent?" "I think," Miss Marple answered, her eyes thoughtful, "that if I wish to poison a particular person in public, I should be very careful indeed where I place the cakes, and I should certainly not wish 3 of them to be dangerous. That suggests either recklessness or a plan not quite so simple as it seems." Miss Marple walked home to her cottage at the end of the lane as twilight folded gently over St. Mary Mead, her slight figure moving with the unhurried precision of one who had long ago learned that haste obscured more than it clarified. Danemead House, usually so serene against the evening sky, now seemed to brood over the village, its windows glimmering faintly like watchful eyes. The next morning brought rain, fine, persistent drizzle that blurred the outlines of hedges and cottages, and with it a downpour of speculation far heavier than the weather. At the grocer's, where Miss Marple presented herself at her customary hour, Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Hartnell were already deeply engaged in the solemn duty of interpreting tragedy. "I always said that girl was not the right sort," Miss Hartnell proclaimed, arranging her string bag with righteous precision. "Foreign blood or near enough. One can't give back the same standards." "Eleanor Morrison is from Surrey, Miss Hartnell," Miss Marple put in mildly, examining a head of lettuce. "Her father was a bank clerk." "Surrey or Serbia, it's all the same nowadays," Miss Hartnell sniffed. "Poison, too, a woman's weapon. Mark my words, Inspector Slack has his culprit neatly wrapped." Miss Marple selected her purchases with apparent absorption, though her mind was elsewhere, on Eleanor's pale, steady face, on David's involuntary exhalation of relief, on Mr. Abbott's anxious mention of the codicil. Human beings, she reflected, often revealed themselves most clearly not in what they did, but in what they were grateful to have escaped. Later, in her neat parlour, scented faintly of lavender, Miss Marple poured tea for herself and for Colonel Melchett, who had called under the pretext of seeking her impressions. The Colonel, long acquainted with Mr. de Marple's quietly formidable mind, no longer troubled to disguise the real purpose of such visits. "Slack thinks it's open and shut," he admitted gloomily, accepting a slice of sea cake. "Girl had access to cakes. and I knew the old lady's habits stood to gain something or other. There always is something, and there was that note she was seen writing. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Notes, Colonel, are curious things. People are so seldom entirely truthful in writing. One is always conscious of posterity, he grunted. What troubles you about it, Jane? Only that it is also very tidy, she replied. Real life, like my garden, is seldom tidy of its own accord. One has to work very hard to make it appear so. I am wondering who has been gardening in this affair. Colonel Melchett frowned. There is the matter of the will, he conceded. Abbott tells me the codicil was to be signed yesterday, after the fete. Changes in provision. He was hazy on the details, said Mrs. Claremont preferred to explain them herself. And now she is unable to do so, Miss Marple said softly. How inconvenient for someone, or very convenient perhaps for someone else. A tap sounded at the door, brisk and self-possessed. Elena Morrison entered at Miss Marple's invitation, her expression strained but determined. She had been released after a night of questioning, though not formally cleared. I heard you were unwell yesterday evening, Miss Marple, this girl said, politely. I wanted to inquire, and, if I am honest, I hoped you might believe I did not harm Mrs. Claremont. Miss Marple regarded her for a long moment, then poured a third cup of tea. My dear, she said gently, why don't we begin with that note you wrote behind the trellis? You see, in villages nothing at all ever goes entirely unseen. Elena's composure wavered at last. For the first time, true fear flickered in her dark eyes. Miss Marple did not attempt to follow Elena at once. Years of quiet observation had taught her that people spoke far more freely when they believed the important business to be happening elsewhere. Instead, she allowed herself to be gently shepherded into the smaller morning room with Mrs. Bantry and a few of the more vocal village ladies, who were already dissecting the tragedy with appalling relish. I always said there was something foreign about that girl, Mrs. Price Ridley proclaimed. Not just the dark hair, an air. Secretive? She's Scottish, not Spanish, Mrs. Fabio. Bantry replied tartly. Mrs. Claremont thought very highly of her. Paid her quite handsomely, too. Depend upon it. Mrs. Price Ridley persisted. It'll be one of these modern arrangements. Companions mixing themselves up in wills. Miss Marple, her knitting serenely resumed, filed that remark away. Wills again. Everyone seemed remarkably interested in the contents of Mrs. Claremont's testament for a woman who, an hour ago, had been very much alive. After a decent interval, she slipped from the chattering group and made her way along the corridor. She had, quite accidentally, you understand, noticed which small sitting room Inspector Slack had appropriated for his private interviews. Voices carried easily through the half-open door. You were to benefit, weren't you? Slack was saying. The codicil. Don't bother denying it. The solicitors already told us there was a provision for you. There was the briefest pause before Elena's voice answered, low but steady. Mrs. Claremont intended to leave me an annuity, 200 a year. She said I had no family and must be provided for. I did not ask her for it, Inspector. A very pretty sum for a young lady with no obligations, Slack said heavily. Out of gratitude, no doubt, you prepared her tea. I prepared tea for everyone, Elena replied. I sliced the cakes, arranged the plates. Miss Claremont chose her own. Miss Marple moved away then. It would not do to be caught eavesdropping. Elderly ladies were expected to be deaf as well as harmless. Yet her mind was curiously stimulated. 200 a year was comfort, not fortune. Hardly enough to justify murder in cold blood, though one must never underestimate desperation. She stepped out onto this terrace where the shadows were lengthening across the lawn. The fate, officially abandoned, lay strewn like the aftermath of a battle. Toppled chairs, abandoned programmons, a single pink paper serviette caught in a rosebush. Tommy Fletcher, the boy who had found the body, sat miserably on the stone balustrade kicking his heels. Miss Marple joined him with the unobtrusive ease of long practice. You gave everyone a terrible fright, Tommy Bow, she said gently. But you were very brave to fetch to Haydock so quickly. I didn't mean to scream, he muttered. It was just her eyes, all funny. I only went to see if there were any cakes left. Ah, the cakes again, Miss Marple murmured. Tell me, dear, when you went into the rose garden, did you see anyone coming out? Tommy frowned, thinking. No, miss, only Mrs. Claremont. And she was already on the ground. But his brow cleared. I did hear something. Like a gate click, the little side gate by the shrubbery. It was just before I saw her. Miss Marple's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her knitting bag. The rose garden's side gate led not toward the house, but to the narrow path skirting the kitchen gardens. Quiet, little used, and, to a clever person, very convenient indeed. "Thank you, Tommy," she said. "You have been most helpful. More helpful, I dare say, than some of our grown-ups." Miss Marple did not head straight for the side gate. Impulse, she had learned, must be dressed in pauldrons if it wished to be useful. Instead, she returned indoors to find Dr. Haydock in quiet conversation with Colonel Melchett near the front hall table, where Vivian Claremont's jewellery, gloves and handbag had been neatly arranged after their removal. The cyanide was taken internally without doubt, Dr. Haydock was saying. Rapid onset, very little time for movement. She probably felt unwell, tried to call for help and collapsed almost at once. "That means the poison was strong, recently ingested, Melchett muttered. "Not something taken hours before." Miss Marple's eyes drifted over the small collection of Vivian's effects. Her handbag, a compact leather affair with a silver clasp, lay slightly open, revealing a neatly folded handkerchief, a powder compact, and a battered little notebook. Not the sort of thing many would notice. Brown, unmarked, practical. "Ah," she said mildly, more to herself than to the others. Mrs. Claremont was keeping notes. Melchett looked at her with distracted impatience. Yes, Miss Marple, but this is police business, you know." "Quite," she agreed placidly, though she noticed he made no move to close the bag. Later, when the house had grown quieter and many of the guests had finally been allowed to go home, Miss Marple wandered out to the garden with the unhurried air of an old lady, seeking fresh air after a trying day. No one stopped her. She was, after all, Miss Marple, and Miss Marple seldom went anywhere very far or very fast. The rose garden bore the melancholy traces of recent horror. Trampled grass, a darkened patch where someone had spilled tea, the outline where Vivian's body had lain still, visible to those who knew where to look. Miss Marple's gaze did not linger there. Instead, she walked directly toward the little wrought-iron side gate partly hidden by overgrown laurel. The latch moved easily under her fingers. No recent oil, but no stiffness either. Someone had used it often enough. On the inner side, half concealed in the grass, she spotted a small scrap of pink paper, crumpled and damp, from where the dew was already beginning to rise. She stooped laboriously, picking it up and smoothing it between careful fingers. The writing was smudged, but a few words remained legible. After the judging, not in front of everyone, you must understand, the hand was neat, sloping slightly to the right. Feminine, Miss Marple thought, but not excessively so. A modern hand. Elena's, possibly. Yet Miss Marple, who had watched Elena's graceful script earlier that very week on a list of charity donations, remembered loops more rounded, capitals more ornate. This writing was different, and tidier, almost As she turned away from the gate, she noticed something else. A faint impression in the soft soil just off the path where the grass gave way to the kitchen garden's tilled earth. Not a complete footprint, but the edge of a heel, narrow and sharp, a woman's shoe. It pointed not toward the house, but away, toward the line of trees bordering the Claremont property, and beyond that the discreetly hidden cottage that had recently been leased, at considerably reduced rent to a certain Mrs. Redford. The campaign. Mary Mead might overlook much, but not the arrival of an unknown widow with expensive luggage and dubious references. By the time Miss Marple returned to her own cottage at the end of the lane, twilight was beginning to settle over the village. She set the pink scrap of paper carefully inside her Bible, between Lamentations and Ezekiel, where few would think to search, and sat down with a cup of hot milk that her maid, faithful Griselda, insisted upon. In the quiet lamplight of her sitting room, patterns began to form. A controlling woman on the verge of altering her will, a companion who would gain security but not extravagantly so, a stepson ruined by his own folly, an unknown widow in a rented cottage, and somewhere in the midst of it, a note arranging a meeting after the judging away from prying eyes. Miss Marple took up her knitting. Murder, she reflected, seldom sprang from a single cause. It was more like a tapestry, many threads woven tightly together, and she had just begun to see the design. It was Mrs. Bantry who unwittingly provided her the next small nudge toward clarity. She swooped upon Miss Marple the following morning in the High Street, her hat at a militant angle and her eyes bright with scandalised excitement. "My dear Jane, have you heard? Inspector Slack has all but decided on a Elena. Poison opportunity, the codicil. He says it's as plain as the nose on one's face." Miss Marple adjusted the string bag on her arm, in which a modest cabbage and half-pound of sugar reposed with quiet dignity. "Noses, Dolly dear, come in various shapes and sizes," she remarked, "and I have frequently observed that what seems plain is often most deceptive. Well, deceptive or not, the village has made up its mind. Foreign, clever, and in the will. What more could the police possibly want? A yellow frock, perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly. "Or failing that, some understanding of human nature." She had already noted, with quiet interest, that Elena was not among the morning shoppers, nor, intriguingly, was Mrs. Price Ridley, who never missed an opportunity to be both seen and obeyed at the butcher's. But another absence struck her more forcibly: Mrs. Agnes Finch, Vivian Claremont's long-serving housekeeper, who usually collected the day's provisions herself. Miss Marple, who believed in the usefulness of small domestic errands as investigative tools, decided that Danemead House might benefit from the little practical assistance in its time of bereavement. Arriving at the back entrance with a covered dish of shepherd's pie, grief requires sustenance, as she told the footman, and she was soon admitted to the warm, steam-scented refuge of the kitchen. Agnes Finch stood at the scrubbed table, her usually firm mouth compressed into a tight line. On the chair beside her lay a neatly folded yellow silk scarf, its edge conspicuously frayed. "Such dreadful business, Miss Marple," Agnes said, her voice low. "Mrs. Claremont was a hard woman, but fair in her own way. The house feels wrong without her." Miss Marple's eyes rested momentarily on the scarf. "Such a pretty thing," she observed. "I do admire a touch of colour. So cheerful." "Not mine," Agnes said quickly. "Left in the morning room yesterday. I thought it might belong to Miss Morrison." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's tone was all mild curiosity. "I understood Miss Morrison favoured darker shades, very becoming to her complexion." Agnes hesitated, then shrugged. "Well, it certainly wasn't Mrs. Claremont's. She said yellow made her look sallow. Leave that to women who can afford frivolity, she used to say." Late there, in the quiet of her own cottage, Miss Marple spread the tiny triangle of silk from the rose garden beside the larger scarf on her table. The weave, colour and sheen were unmistakably identical. Someone had been through that side gate in haste, tearing the scarf in the process. Someone who had then abandoned the damaged accessory in the morning room, perhaps hoping it would be mistakenly attributed to another. Her reflection was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Colonel Melchett, looking grave, accepted her offer of tea with unusual meekness. "We've had a development, Miss Marple," he said heavily. "Slack's feeling very pleased with himself. The chemist in Much Benham has confirmed the recent purchase of potassium cyanide, signed for, in fact." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Signed for? How modern!" "So, yes, it was obtained for supposed photographic purposes. The signature on the form was Elena Morrison." The kettle began to whistle softly on the hob as if in quiet protest. Miss Marple rose to pour the water, her movements unhurried, but her mind suddenly very alert. Evidence was beginning to accumulate with almost theatrical neatness around the young companion. Far too neatly, she thought, for genuine truth. Someone somewhere was arranging their stage with great care. Inspector Slack received Miss Marple's request to be present with marked reluctance, but the success of her previous interventions in county matters had given her a certain unofficial standing with the police. He consoled himself with the thought that an elderly spinster with knitting could hardly obstruct official procedure. They convened in the small study off the hall, a room lined with sober legal volumes that had belonged to the late Mr. Claremont. A single lamp cast a pool of yellow light over the writing desk, giving the scene an oddly theatrical air, as though a play were about to begin. Elena sat upright in the hard-backed chair opposite Slack, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Miss Marple chose a position slightly to one side where she could see both Eleanor's face and the inspector's notes, her knitting lying apparently forgotten in her basket. "We'll go over it once more," Slack began, his tone heavy with a weary patience. "You arranged the refreshments, including the petit fours. You admit that freely. You knew Mrs. Claremont preferred the pink iced ones. You were the last person seen speaking with her before she went to the rose garden." Elena met his gaze without flinching. "All of that's true, Inspector. but none of it proves I poisoned her. Many people passed by that table. Several ladies helped themselves and rearranged the plates. I was called away twice to the telephone. Your own constable can confirm that. Slack's pen scratched across the paper. Convenient telephone calls, those? No message was left, according to Mrs. Weatherby at the exchange. Merely a request that you be summoned to the box, and then nothing. A hoax Miss Morrison provided to give you an alibi while the cakes were being tampered with. For the first time, a flicker of genuine surprise crossed Elena's composed features. A hoax, she repeated slowly. And someone wanted me away from that table, Inspector. Surely that tells against your theory rather than for it. Why would I contrive to remove myself from the very place you say I used to kill her? Miss Marple, who'd remained silent thus far, allowed herself a small, seemingly vague remark. Of course, my dear, there are people who do like to be thought more foolish than they are. One hears of criminals who create alibis so clumsy that everyone is certain they must be innocent. Ellen turned to her, eyes dark. Do you believe that of me, ma'am? Miss Marple? There was something urgent in the question, as though the opinion of this elderly woman mattered rather more than that of the official investigator. Miss Marple considered before replying, her fingers gently smoothing the wool in her lap. I believe, she said at last, that you are very much afraid for yourself, yes, but also for someone else. And I have noticed, Miss Morrison, that truly guilty people are seldom frightened in quite that particular way. Her mild words made even Inspector Slack glance up sharply from his notes. The effect of Miss Marple's remark was subtle but distinct, like the first faint tremor before an earthquake. Conversation resumed after a heartbeat's pause, but its tone had altered. Glances became sidelong, movements mean or self-conscious. Only one person in the room seemed genuinely unable to help his reaction. Mr. Abbey, whose fingers strayed twice more to his lapel before he mastered the impulse. Elena, seated quietly by the window, lifted her head, with a faint spark of hope in her eyes. David, pale and dishevelled after his earlier ordeal, looked merely bewildered. Inspector Slack, unfortunately, looked gratified. Paint stains, eh? He said heavily. Very clever, Miss Marple. We'll have everyone's coats and jackets up to the station in the morning, then. All in hand, all in hand. Miss Marple smiled vaguely, as if her remark had been no more than idle chatter. Oh, I dare say the murderer has already taken very great care with their clothing, Inspector. One expects that in an intelligent criminal. They are rather less careful, I have noticed, about what they cannot remove. Such as what? Slack demanded. Fear, said Miss Marple simply, or overconfidence. They often betray themselves when they believe the danger has passed. It was not until later that evening, when most of the guests had finally been sent home, and Danemead House had resumed a fragile semblance of order, that Miss Marple placed her final small test in motion. She contrived, with the innocent efficiency of a village busybody, to gather the remaining principals in the smaller drawing-room. David, Eleanor, Mr. Abbott de Haydock, Mrs. Bantry, and Inspector Slack himself. The excuse was practical enough. I thought Marple, Mr. Marple said mildly, that before everyone departs, it might be helpful to reconstruct matters. My memory is not what it was, you know. I should like to be quite clear about who was where. Slack, who believed he already knew precisely who was where, allowed it with ill-concealed impatience. Go on then, he said, if it helps settle people's minds. Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting bag. We know that the cyanide acted quickly. Therefore, the poison must have been introduced into the petit four shortly before Mrs. Claremont took it. That means the murderer needed both access to the cakes and certainty about which one she would choose. She always took the pink-iced ones, David muttered. Everyone knew that. Just so, Miss Marple agreed. And therefore anyone who prepared 3 identically poisoned to pink petit four understood that she would almost attempt to take one. But there is something far more interesting than that. She let the words drift out gently, like bait on a quiet stream. Someone tried to kill Mrs. Claremont previously with arsenic in chocolates. Someone with rather more patience and less theatricality. Eleanor's eyes flickered to David. Mr. Curtis Abbott's jaw tightened. Dr. Haydock leaned forward, suddenly very still. Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational. Arsenic in chocolates, cyanide in cakes, a side gate thoughtfully oiled, a note designed to lure Miss Morrison into a compromising position, a conveniently planted bottle in Mr. I don't know, Claremont's coat. This is not the work of an impulsive man in debt. It is the work of someone with legal knowledge, chemical understanding, and, I fancy, a strong dislike of uncertainty. Her gaze, mild and bird-like, rested on Mr. Someone, she added softly, who could not afford to have a new codicil signed this afternoon, because it would have revealed that certain charitable investments were not but basically, in fact, what they seemed. For a fraction of a second, the room held its breath. Then, quite unexpectedly, another voice cut across the tension. High, strained, and utterly desperate. "You old cat!" David shouted, surging to his feet. "You don't know what you're talking about. It was me, do you hear? It was me!" The confession rang through the room with shocking force. Yet even as Inspector Slack sprang forward in clumsy triumph, Miss Marple's slight frown deepened. The timing, she thought, was all wrong. Someone had just panicked far too soon. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The ticking of the mantel clock seemed unnaturally loud. Then, with a small defeated motion, Mr. Abbott slipped a finger under his lapel and drew out the edge of the waistcoat as though it were some reluctant creature being led into the light. The yellow silk caught the lamplight bright and unmistakable. Along the lower hem, half hidden in a fold, ran a thin smear of cracked, darkened green. Inspector Slack stepped forward sharply. "What have you been doing in the shrubbery, sir? That path was supposed to be cordoned off during the fete." Abbott gave a short, mirthless laugh. "You think a smear of paint proves murder? Gardeners splash paint everywhere. Not on waistcoats worn only on special occasions," Miss Marple said mildly. "And not that particular shade. I took the trouble earlier to look at the tin beside the pyjama. You must have brushed it when you reached over to latch it behind you." He turned on her, then the last veneer of professional politeness dropping from his face. "You meddling old woman," he said softly. The quietness of it was far more dangerous than any shout. "You have no idea what you are talking about." "But I do, I'm afraid," Miss Marple answered, without heat. "You advised Mrs. Claremont when she set up the charity. You suggested David as figurehead trustee because his weakness made him useful. When he borrowed from the fund in desperation, you were ready with forms for him to sign, thinking it a temporary loan. Only you kept the withdrawals going long after he believed them stopped." David stared at Abbott, stricken. "You said the accounts were in order, that you'd straightened everything out." "Of course he did," Miss Marple continued gently. "You never read what you signed, did you? Claremont, you left it to your trusted solicitor. Such a common failing." Inspector Slack, sensing his moment, moved between Abbott and the door. "You'll come along to the station now, sir." Abbott's eyes flashed. "On what? Hypotheses and gossip?" "On more than that," Miss Marple said. "You couldn't risk Mrs. Claresemont speaking to the police after today's codicil." She had finally examined the ledgers herself. Elena showed her how she intended to sign the codicil here, in public, then send for the authorities tomorrow. Abbott's jaw tightened. "You selected cyanide instead of arsenic this time," Miss Marple went on, "because Elena had already detected the arsenic in the chocolates and was watching. Cyanide is swift and concealed well in almond fayeur. A bufflebuy. You had access to the cakes when you arrived early with legal papers, and again when you so helpfully assisted the ladies arranging the tea." Elena gasped softly. "You carried the tray, said it was too heavy for Mrs. Bantry, and placed 3 poisoned cakes," Miss Marple nodded, "because one would have looked deliberate. If a child had taken one, you meant to let David hang for it." The bottle in his coat completed the picture. There was a long silence. The facade of respectable horror on Abbott's face wavered, then hardened into something flat and cold. "She would have ruined me," he said at last. The words were almost reflective. 10 years of quiet, careful adjustments, and suddenly she decides to become observant. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "That does happen, you know. People grow older and have less to occupy them. They begin to look more closely at things." Abbott glanced toward the French windows as though measuring distance and chance. Slack, who for once needed no prompting, was already signalling to Constable Polk outside. "It was never meant to be, though. Crude," Abbott said suddenly, almost to himself. "I told David we would fix everything. He was so eager to believe it." His mouth twisted. "Fools shouldn't be allowed near money." "Nor scoundrels near trust," Miss Marple murmured. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Abbott turned to her with a curious, almost courteous look. "You might have made an excellent criminal, Miss Marple," he said, "if you'd been a different sort of woman." "Oh no," she replied, with genuine alarm. "I have never been clever, only observant. It is people who make themselves obvious, you know." They led him away. The door shut decisively behind the little procession. For a moment, the room seemed to exhale. David sank into a chair, covering his face. So all this time, it was him, and I helped. "Oh, in a manner of speaking," Miss Marple said gently. "But weakness is not quite the same as wickedness, Mr. Claremont. You will have to answer for your part, of course. Yet I fancy the courts will see a difference." Later, after statements were taken and the house at last began to empty, Miss Marple walked home along the quiet St. Mary Mead Lane, the evening air cool against her cheeks. Behind lace curtains, lights glowed and silhouettes bent together in the universal posture of gossip. By tomorrow, she knew the village would have its settled version of events, each teller polishing their role. At her cottage, she set aside her hat and gloves and smoothed the familiar crochet antimacassar on her armchair. The ticking clock, the faint scent of lavender polish, the kettle's slow rumble, everything precisely as it had always been. Yet as she took up her knitting once more, her fingers rested for a moment on the worn needles. "Human nature," she said softly into the empty room. "So very predictable in its foolishness, and yet every time just different enough." The wool began to move through her hands with its accustomed ease. Row following row, quiet and regular, while outside St. Mary Mead settled back into its apparently peaceful sleep in the days that followed. Mary Mead returned to its customary rhythms with a determination that was almost defiant. Lawns were mown, hedges clipped, and the grocer's bell resumed its familiar clanging in the high street. Yet beneath the surface, the village hummed with a quieter, deeper current, a mixture of relief, unease, and the peculiar satisfaction that comes from having been in proximity too. A great drama without suffering its worst consequences. At the Blue Boar, Mr. and Mrs. Toms exchanged the latest versions of events over polished pewter and frothing pints. The tale altered slightly with each telling. Tommy Fletcher became by turns a brave young hero or a tragically scarred witness. Elena Morrison was either a wronged angel or a suspicious foreigner from the north, and Miss Marple's role ranged from quite a help, I dare say, to the real brains of the whole thing, if you want my opinion. Miss Marple herself remained serenely indifferent to such speculations. She sat by her parlour window at Cherry Trees, a shaft of afternoon light resting on her silver hair, her knitting balanced neatly in her lap. The garden bush beyond her window was in late summer glory, hollyhocks standing like sentinels, roses offering their last defiant blooms, and the delphiniums managing a smaller second flourish after a ruthless deadheading. Haydock, having announced his visit in his usual perfunctory knock, settled himself with the air of a man determined to disguise concern as casual acquaintance. "You look tired, Jane," he remarked, peering at her with professional frankness. "All this business at Danemead has taken it out of you. You're not 25, you know." "I have not been 25 for some little time, Doctor," Miss Marple replied placidly, "but I assure you the mind is quite invigorated by a little exercise now and then. It is rather like the garden. If one leaves it entirely alone, it runs to seed." He harumphed, but said nothing, accustomed as he was to being gently parried. After a moment he added, "Colonel Melchett asked me to tell you that Scotland Yard was most impressed with your assistance." Again, "Slack is less forthcoming, of course, but even he admits you noticed what he might have missed." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Inspector Slack is an excellent policeman in his way. He sounds so sure of himself that guilty people are often betrayed by their relief at having escaped his suspicions. A very useful quality in a man, if properly understood." They sat in companionable silence for a moment. From the lane outside came the faint sound of children's laughter and the rattle of a bicycle over loose stones. The world, Miss Marple thought, had an admirable talent for continuing. "And Elena," she asked at last, "how does she fare?" "Remarkably well, all things considered," Haydock replied. "She's accepted a position in London, laboratory work, I gather. Some charitable concern, Clement helped arrange it. She intends to make a proper career of her chemistry." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "How very suitable. One should always make use of one's gifts, don't you think, Doctor? It prevents them from being misabeled." He rose to leave, pausing at the door. "This business with Abbott, embezzlement. Embezzlement, fraud, murder. One might think you'd seen enough of such things by now. Enough to last anyone a lifetime. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. Evil is rather like bindweed, I've always thought, she said slowly. You may clear a patch quite thoroughly, but if you turn your back altogether, it finds its way in again, under the fence or over the wall. One does what one can while one can, and pulling it up where it shows itself. When he had gone, the little house grew very still. Miss Marple sat motionless for a long time, the half-finished cardigan resting forgotten in her lap. The events at Danemead had crystallised something she had long known, but rarely acknowledged, that her strength, like the daylight outside, was slowly but surely shortening with the season. Yet there was no melancholy in her reflection, only a gentle, almost affectionate acceptance. She thought of the faces at Danemead House. David's bewildered shame, Elena's hard-won steadiness, Abbott's betraying flicker of fear, human nature, in all its folly and courage and selfishness and unexpected grace. It had been her lifelong study, as absorbing as any profession. Outside, a thrush began to sing in the elder tree, its notes clear and insistent. Miss Marple picked up her needles once more. There would be, she suspected, fewer cases ahead than behind, but if wickedness showed its face again in Mary Mead, she would still be here for a little while yet, ready to notice the torn silk, the careless word, the fleeting expression that told the truth. For now, though, there was her garden, her knitting, and the quiet, enduring comfort of knowing that, for this time at least, justice had been gently, firmly, and quite satisfactorily done. It was several weeks before St. Mary Mead fully returned to its accustomed rhythm, but English villages, like English lawns, have a remarkable talent for smoothing over disturbances. By September, the roses at Danemead House had finished blooming. The fete decorations were long since packed away. The murder of Mrs. Vivian Claremont had already begun its slow transition from shocking news to well-polished anecdote. Life, as it invariably does, moved on. News of Arthur Abbott's swift conviction filtered back in fragments. Short notices in the newspaper, a letter from Colonel Melchett, a comment from Dr. Haydock. The verdict had surprised no one who knew the whole story. Indeed, the most remarkable thing about the trial was how unremarkable it proved to be. Once the ledgers were examined and Abbott's correspondence inspected, the pattern of embezzlement and manipulation emerged with almost clinical clarity. His elaborate cleverness, so formidable in the shadows, looked pitifully small under the clear light of a courtroom. I suppose that's always the way, Miss Marple remarked to Dr. Haydock one afternoon, as they shared tea in her neat little sitting room. Things that seem so dark and tangled at close quarters become almost simple when laid out plainly. A wickedness that appeared clever proves merely squalid. Haydock stirred his tea with unnecessary vigour. He nearly got away with it, though. If you hadn't noticed that bit of silk, Joan... It wasn't the silk alone, Miss Marple interrupted mildly. It was the way he behaved. The silk simply confirmed what his manners had already told me. The doctor smiled ruefully. Trust you to prefer human nature to physical evidence. I've always found it more reliable, Miss Marple replied. People reveal themselves in the most extraordinary little ways, if one is content to sit quietly and let them. News of David and Eleanor reached her by more appealing channels. A letter arrived, written in a neat, decisive hand on Danemead House stationery, describing in modest terms the gradual unravelling of Abbott's tangled accounts, the careful restoration of misdirected charity funds, and the establishment of a more transparent system of trusteeship. At the very end, in a smaller, less certain script, came a brief postscript. We wondered, Miss Marple, if you might do us the kindness of being godmother, unofficially, of course, to whatever future we manage to build here. It would be something to know that our attempts at decent living have, as it were, your blessing. Miss Marple had smiled at that, folding the letter with careful satisfaction. It pleased her, in a quiet way, to know that out of such ugly business something decent and hopeful had emerged. It often did, she reflected, when evil was faced squarely rather than explained away. One crisp October morning, as she sat by the window with her knitting, and watched a blackbird hopping industriously along the garden path, Mrs. Bantry arrived in a whirl of autumn-coloured tweed and uncontainable curiosity. Jane, I have it on the best authority that the Chief Constable said, quite seriously, mind you, that without your help they'd never have seen through Abbott. And there's talk, actual talk, of your being consulted officially on difficult cases. Imagine that, our Jane practically a professional. Miss Marple counted her stitches with deliberate care before replying. That would be very foolish of them, Dolly. I'm much too old to go gallivanting about after murderers. Besides, the police have quite enough cleverness of their own. They don't need a tiresome old woman cluttering up their inquiries." Mrs. Bantry regarded her shrewdly. "You know, don't you, that everyone is saying this was your finest case? Your final case, they even call it, in tones positively dripping with drama. People will say anything if it makes a better story," Miss Marple observed. "As for final, one never knows, Dolly. Have no ambition for more murders, I assure you. But if wickedness insists on presenting itself in my immediate vicinity, it would be quite wrong not to notice it, don't you think, Miss?" Bantry laughed, satisfied with this, as they were both closest thing to a promise she was likely to get. "Well, if it is your last, Jane, it's a very good one to end on." When she had gone, Miss Marple remained by the window, her needles moving with their familiar restful rhythm. The village lay very still in the pale autumn light, chimneys smoking faintly, a child pushing a pram along the lane, the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere toward the common. It might indeed be her last case, she reflected. Age brought its own limitations, and bodies, unlike minds, paid little attention to one's preferences, yet she felt no melancholy at the thought. She had seen over long years that good and evil continued their eternal dance quite independently of any one observer. If it pleased Providence to employ an elderly spinster in a small corner of that struggle now and then, she was content to have served as she could. Her satisfaction lay not in cleverness nor in notoriety, but in the modest certainty that in this instance at least truth had been seen clearly and acted upon. The innocent had been spared, the guilty unmasked, and the small, fragile order of St. Mary Mead restored. Outside, a gust of wind and a flurry of golden russet leaves swirling across the lane. Miss Marple watched them with quiet pleasure, then returned her attention to her knitting. The pattern was a familiar one, but there was always satisfaction in seeing each small stitch fall into its proper place, like clues, like people, like the intricate, untidy tapestry of human nature itself. Whatever remained for her, she thought, would be enough.